It was the kind of neighborhood where nothing ever seemed out of place, until it did. In the quiet suburban corners of Ashburn, Virginia, whispers of scandal were rare but never unnoticed. That was where Samira Khan's story began to unravel. Born in 1987 in Lahore, Pakistan, Samira moved to the States after marrying Amir Khan in 2010. Amir was the definition of success. A wealthy entrepreneur with an expanding business empire, charming, confident, and respected. Their life seemed perfect, with a beautiful home, 2 young children, and everything the American dream promised. Samira appeared to have it all. But as with most seemingly perfect lives, darkness often lurks beneath the surface. Amir's work kept him away more than it kept him home. What started as business trips a few times a year quickly turned into weeks of absence. He was building an empire, he always said, but in doing so, he'd left his wife behind in a world of isolation. She was more than just lonely. She felt invisible. Trapped in a golden cage, she longed for something she couldn't name, and before long, she found herself caught in the dangerous web of temptation. That temptation had a name: David Foster. A Christian, born and raised in Virginia, David lived just 2 doors down from the Khans. He wasn't what you'd call extraordinary, average job, average life. But he noticed Samira in ways Amir never did. They'd met casually at a neighborhood barbecue one summer. What started as polite small talk, her Pakistani heritage, his southern roots, grew into something far more intimate. David was the opposite of Amir. Easygoing, warm, and always around. Samira hadn't intended to get close, but she found herself gravitating toward his easy smile, his undemanding company. The more Amir traveled, the more David seemed to linger in her thoughts. It wasn't long before the neighborly chats turned into something more. Their affair began with simple conversations over coffee, but soon, the secrecy added a layer of excitement neither of them had ever felt before. Each stolen glance, every accidental touch in the hallway, fueled a fire inside her that Samira thought had long been extinguished. She knew it was wrong, a betrayal not only of her marriage but of her faith. But she was too far gone to stop. The affair escalated with each passing day. Amir was none the wiser, his attention fully absorbed by his business ventures, leaving his wife to navigate her treacherous secret alone. Samira knew it was only a matter of time before their affair became something more dangerous than thrilling. And deep down, David knew it too. But neither could stop the spiral. Then came the night when everything changed. It was late December, a frigid night, and Amir had once again left for a week-long business trip. Samira invited David over, just for coffee, just to talk, they told themselves. But the boundary they'd carefully danced around had long since shattered. The air was thick with unspoken desire, and neither had the strength to resist. That night, passion eclipsed reason, and the consequences of their actions would soon haunt them both. It was a bitter irony, really. In a world that seemed so perfectly constructed, it only took a crack for everything to fall apart. The affair between Samira and David was like a slow poison seeping into their lives, unnoticed at first but growing deadlier with each stolen moment. For a while, Samira thought they were in control. They were careful, meeting only when they knew it was safe, making sure their conversations sounded innocent when anyone was nearby. But as the affair deepened, caution gave way to recklessness. The excitement of their secret began to cloud their judgment, and soon, cracks began to form in the lives they had built. David had always been good at hiding his emotions. To his wife, Lisa, he was the same calm and steady man she had always known. But Lisa wasn't naive. After 10 years of marriage, she could sense something had shifted. She couldn't put her finger on it, but David was distracted more often. The casual affection they once shared had grown mechanical, and Lisa noticed the late-night phone calls and the sudden excuses to leave the house. At first, Lisa told herself it was nothing. She trusted David. After all, what could possibly be going on in their sleepy little town? But that seed of doubt, once planted, began to grow. And in her quiet moments, while David was out and the children were asleep, Lisa's thoughts wandered to darker places. She wondered if she was losing him, if the life they'd built together was slipping through her fingers. Samira wasn't faring much better. Every time she was with David, She was filled with a dangerous mix of ecstasy and guilt. She knew this affair couldn't last forever, but part of her didn't care. The passion she felt with David was something she hadn't experienced in years. It was an escape from the suffocating loneliness she felt in her marriage to Amir. But with every kiss, with every secret meeting, the weight of her betrayal grew heavier. And Amir, ever the devoted husband, ever the hard worker, was blissfully ignorant of it all. His focus remained squarely on his business, where he was finalizing the biggest deal of his career. In his eyes, life was going well. His marriage seemed solid, his children happy, and his wife, well, she seemed a little distant, but he assumed it was just the strain of managing the household. He never suspected that something far more sinister was lurking just beneath the surface. Everything changed one cold January evening. David was in Samira's home, an hour before Amir was due to return from his business trip. They had become more reckless, believing their secret was safe. But as they sat close on the couch, whispering and laughing like they had no cares in the world, neither of them realized that Lisa had grown suspicious enough to act. That day, Lisa had found a strange text on David's phone, a message from Samira that didn't seem right. It was just a simple, "Can't wait to see you again." But Lisa knew better. Her stomach churned as she pieced it together. The missed calls, the long absences, the quiet conversations when David thought she wasn't paying attention. Her heart pounded as she drove toward Samira's house. Lisa didn't know what she'd find, but she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling inside her anymore. She parked down the street, her hands trembling on the wheel. From the outside, everything looked normal. The lights were on, the house looked peaceful, like any other night. But Lisa knew better. Inside, Samira and David were in the middle of a quiet conversation when they heard a car door slam. David froze. He recognized the sound. It was Lisa's car. "What's wrong?" Samira asked, sensing his sudden tension. "It's Lisa," David whispered. Standing up, panic flashed across his face. "Are you sure?" Samira's voice wavered. David nodded, already pacing. "She knows. She has to know." Samira's heart raced. They'd been so careful. How could she know? Lisa stood outside the door, her hand hovering over the doorbell. She wasn't sure what she'd do if David answered. But before she could make her decision, the door opened, and there he was, David, and behind him, Samira, standing in the hallway, wide-eyed and guilty. In that moment, the cracks in their carefully constructed lives shattered. Lisa didn't need to ask. The truth was written all over their faces. "What the hell is this?" Lisa's voice trembled with fury. She looked between the two of them, her face pale and tight with anger. David opened his mouth, but no words came. There was nothing he could say that would undo the damage. "Lisa, it's not," Samira started, but Lisa cut her off. Don't you dare," she hissed, her eyes burning with rage. "How long has this been going on?" Neither David nor Samira could speak. The silence was damning. "You disgust me," Lisa spat, her voice trembling with emotion. "Both of you." Before David could stop her, Lisa turned and stormed off. David ran after her, leaving Samira standing there, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear Lisa's car screech as it sped away, and she knew, in that moment, that their secret was out. But this wasn't just about an affair anymore. The confrontation had set off a chain of events that neither David nor Samira could control. The affair, once intoxicating and thrilling, was now a ticking time bomb, and they had no idea how devastating the fallout would be. The days that followed Lisa's discovery were anything but quiet. Samira felt as if her life had been turned upside down. The weight of her secret affair with David now sat squarely on her shoulders, ready to crush her at any moment. She spent every waking hour terrified. Terrified that Lisa would tell Amir, terrified that her children would find out, terrified of the shame that would come crashing down upon her once the truth spread through the tight-knit neighborhood. For David, it was no different. His home life had turned into a war zone. Lisa barely spoke to him, and when she did, her words were drenched in venom. She hadn't told anyone yet, not even their children, but David knew it was only a matter of time before she couldn't hold it in any longer. The guilt gnawed at him, making it difficult to sleep, to focus, to even breathe. Amir returned home that weekend, completely unaware of the storm brewing just below the surface. He greeted Samira with his usual smile, kissed her on the cheek, and made small talk about his trip. Samira, barely able to maintain her composure, forced herself to smile back. But every word, every glance felt like an unbearable lie. The tension between her and David hadn't gone unnoticed. Lisa had stopped coming around, and Samira's phone rang constantly with unanswered calls from him. David was panicking, desperate to talk, but Samira couldn't afford to take the risk anymore. She knew they were spiraling out of control, and if Amir ever found out, it wouldn't just be her reputation on the line. It could be her life. And then, on a Tuesday morning, everything came crashing down. Amir had left early for a business meeting. The kids were at school, and Samira sat alone in the kitchen, her thoughts a whirlwind of guilt and fear. She jumped when she heard a knock at the door. Peeking through the window, her heart sank. It was Lisa. For a long moment, Samira debated whether to answer. But the look on Lisa's face wasn't one of fury. It was worse. It was calm, too calm. She knew she couldn't avoid her. Slowly, Samira opened the door. "Lisa," she whispered, her voice already trembling. Lisa walked in without being invited, her gaze piercing. "You ruined everything," she said coldly. Samira swallowed hard. "I'm sorry. I never wanted this." "You didn't want it?" Lisa spat, her voice rising. "You didn't want it, but you did it anyway. Do you even know what you've done?" Tears welled in Samira's eyes. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." Lisa shook her head, her face twisting with disgust. "You think this is just about you and David? This is bigger than your little affair, Samira. This is about families, about our children, about everything we built." Samira felt the room closing in on her. "Please, Lisa, don't tell Amir. I'll end it. I swear, I'll end it." But Lisa just stood there, unmoved. "You think ending it will fix this? It's too late. It's already over." She turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "You better pray that Amir doesn't find out from someone else." As soon as Lisa was gone, Samira collapsed onto the floor, her sobs racking her body. This was it. She knew that Lisa was right. It didn't matter if she ended the affair. It was too late. The damage was done. Meanwhile, across town, David sat at work, his mind far from the spreadsheets in front of him. His phone buzzed relentlessly, but he ignored it. He knew it was Lisa. She hadn't spoken to him since she confronted Samira, but she hadn't left him either. It was like she was biding her time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And she wasn't the only one. Amir, completely oblivious to the affair, had begun to sense something was wrong with Samira. She had been distant ever since he returned from his trip, more distant than usual. Her laughter, once so natural, now felt forced. And when their eyes met, there was something there, something dark. It gnawed at him, even though he didn't know what it was. But Amir was not a man to ignore his gut. He started paying closer attention, watching Samira when she thought he wasn't looking, asking casual questions about her day, listening carefully to her responses. Little things didn't add up. Late-night trips to the store, moments when her phone would buzz and she'd rush to silence it. And then, one afternoon, while scrolling through her phone for a family photo, he found it. A message from David, short but incriminating. "I miss you. When can I see you again?" Amir's world crumbled in an instant. The message played over and over in his mind like a broken record, but the words barely registered. His chest tightened with rage, betrayal coursing through his veins. How long had it been going on? How could he have been so blind? He didn't confront Samira right away. He wanted answers, and he wasn't sure he'd get them from her. Instead, he waited, watching, calculating his next move. He needed to see David, man to man. He needed the truth. That evening, Samira sensed something was off. Amir was quiet, too quiet. He didn't ask about her day, didn't talk about work, didn't even look at her. He just sat there, staring at his phone, his fingers tapping the screen with a strange intensity. She knew the moment had come. He knew. She could feel it in the air. The phone buzzed, breaking the silence. Amir glanced at the screen, his eyes narrowing as he read the message. Without a word, he stood up, grabbed his coat, and walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" Samira asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Amir paused, his hand on the door handle, but didn't turn around. "To settle something," he said coldly before walking out the door. Samira's heart sank. She knew exactly where he was going. Amir drove through the winding suburban streets, his grip tight on the steering wheel. His thoughts were racing, a flood of anger, betrayal, and hurt coursing through him. He was headed to David's house. There was no more room for doubt. He needed the truth, face to face, and no amount of smooth talking from David was going to stop him. It wasn't long before Amir pulled up outside David's home. The house was quiet, lights off, and for a moment Amir considered that David wasn't there. But as he sat there, the front door opened, and there was David, stepping out into the night. David hadn't noticed Amir yet, but the second their eyes met, everything froze. Amir got out of the car, his movements deliberate, every step carrying the weight of his rage. David's face shifted from surprise to panic. "Amir," David started, but Amir's fury cut him off. "How long?" Amir's voice was low, but the threat was unmistakable. He took another step forward, his hands trembling with barely contained rage. "How long have you been sleeping with my wife?" David stumbled over his words, his voice wavering. "It's not what you think, I swear. It just happened." Amir lunged at him, shoving him hard against the side of his car. "You think that's an answer?" His voice was a snarl, full of venom. David flinched but didn't fight back. He wasn't that kind of man, and he knew that in this moment, he had no right to defend himself. "Amir, I'm sorry," David gasped, struggling to keep his composure. "I never meant for it to go this far." But that was the wrong thing to say. Amir's hand shot up, grabbing David by the collar. "Go this far? You think this is some mistake? You destroyed everything I had, everything we built. For what? For what, David?" His voice cracked, the pain breaking through the rage. David didn't have an answer. How could he explain it? It had started with excitement, a spark of passion he hadn't felt in years. But now, standing here, looking into the eyes of a man he had betrayed so deeply, none of it made sense anymore. "I'm sorry," David whispered, his voice barely audible, but sorry wasn't enough. Not for Amir. Not after what he had uncovered. Amir let go of David, pushing him away with disgust. He turned and took a deep breath, trying to control the rage that was boiling over inside him. He couldn't bring himself to hit David again. It would only ruin him further. But he knew that this was far from over. "You're going to tell her it's over," Amir said quietly, his back still turned to David, "and then you're going to disappear. If I see you near my family again." He didn't finish the sentence, but the threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. David nodded shakily, knowing there was no other way out. "I will. I swear. It's over." Amir didn't respond. Without another word, he got into his car and drove off, leaving David standing there in the dark, his entire world crumbling around him. Meanwhile, Samira sat at home, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. Amir had been gone for hours, and she feared the worst. She knew where he had gone, to confront David, and the thought terrified her. What would Amir do? Would he come back, or would everything she had feared finally come to pass? The house was suffocatingly silent. Her children slept upstairs, unaware of the chaos that was about to consume their lives. Samira knew she couldn't hide the truth much longer. Lisa had already threatened to expose everything, and now, Amir's confrontation with David had likely sealed her fate. When Amir finally returned, the sound of the door opening echoed through the quiet house like a thunderclap. Samira stood frozen in the living room as Amir walked in, his face a mask of cold fury. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm, but Samira could hear the storm behind it. She nodded, her throat dry. "I know." Amir sat down on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped together as if to keep himself from lashing out. "How long?" he asked quietly, the same question he had thrown at David just hours before. Samira's eyes filled with tears, and she could barely find her voice. "A few months," she whispered, her words barely audible. "A few months?" Amir's voice rose, his anger finally breaking through. He stood up, pacing the room. "You've been lying to me for months? Behind my back? In our own home?" "I never meant for this to happen," Samira sobbed. "I didn't want to hurt you." Amir's laughter was bitter, hollow. "Didn't want to hurt me? You didn't think about that when you were with him, did you?" Samira's guilt was overwhelming. She had no defense, no explanation that would make any of this better. She had betrayed the man she once loved, the father of her children, and there was no way to undo what had been done. "I should have seen it," Amir said, shaking his head. "I should have known. But I trusted you. I trusted you with everything." The silence that followed was unbearable. Samira wanted to say something, anything, that could make things right, but she knew nothing she said could change the truth. She had destroyed the one thing she swore to protect. "Does Lisa know?" Amir finally asked, his voice hollow. Samira nodded slowly. "She found out a few days ago." Amir let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Of course she knows. And now everyone else will, too." "No, please, Amir," Samira begged, stepping toward him. "We can fix this. We can get through this. Please, don't let it end like this." But Amir didn't move. He just stared at her, his expression cold and distant. "There's nothing left to fix, Samira." Her heart sank. She had feared this moment for months, but now that it was here, it was worse than she could have imagined. The life they had built together, the family they had raised, it was all falling apart in front of her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "I want you out," Amir said quietly. "Tomorrow, you take the kids and leave." Samira's knees buckled as his words hit her like a blow. "Amir, please." "Don't," he said, cutting her off again. "Don't beg. Don't cry. This was your choice. Now live with it." Samira collapsed onto the couch, her body shaking with sobs. She had known this day would come, but now that it was happening, she couldn't bear it. She had lost everything. The man she loved, the life they had built, the future they had planned. All for a fleeting affair that had spiraled so far out of control, it had consumed everything in its path. Amir turned to leave, but as his hand reached for the door, he paused. "I talked to David," he said, his voice low. Samira froze, her heart pounding in her chest. What did you do?" "I didn't hurt him," Amir said, his voice cold, "but I made sure he'll never come near you again." Samira closed her eyes, relief flooding through her, though it was mixed with a deep sense of shame. She couldn't imagine what Amir had said to David, but she was grateful that it hadn't ended in violence. When Amir finally left the house, the silence that followed was deafening. Samira sat there for what felt like hours, staring blankly at the walls of the home that no longer felt like hers. She knew she had to pack, had to leave, but her body felt too heavy to move. As the dawn broke through the windows, Samira rose and made her way upstairs to her children's rooms. They were still sleeping, their innocent faces peaceful and unaware of the chaos that had unfolded. She stood there for a long time, watching them, knowing that by tomorrow, their lives would be different. The guilt that had been eating away at her for months now felt unbearable. She had destroyed her family, not just for herself, but for them. How could they understand? How could she ever explain to them why their world had crumbled? Hours later, as Samira loaded the last suitcase into her car, she took one final look at the house. The place that had once been her sanctuary now felt like a distant memory. She had lost everything. The man who once adored her, the life they had built, the future she had hoped for. All because of a mistake that could never be undone. David's calls had finally stopped. He hadn't shown up, and she knew why. Amir had dealt with him, made it clear that there was no place for him in her life anymore. Samira didn't know what David was going through, and for once, she didn't care. It was over. As she drove away from the house, her children still asleep in the back seat, Samira couldn't help but wonder how it had all come to this. What had once been a simple affair, an escape from the loneliness, had become a nightmare. A nightmare she could never wake up from. There was no going back now, no fixing what had been broken. Her life, once perfect from the outside, was now nothing more than shattered glass, each piece reflecting the choices that had led her here. And as the house disappeared from view, Samira knew one thing for certain. she would never be the same again.